Well, it is great to be here. I've been here before and it feels like coming home and just feeling very much part of St Andrews. But it's different. What an amazing job you've done in terms of the foyer and the building project. And just, you walk in and there's wow. It just feels so fresh. And having been a church leader for many years and done a number of these projects, I know how tough they can be, the challenge of them, the working together on all the finance and the logistics and coming together and making it happen. But it's a sign, as Simon said earlier, of a vision for the future. Of just as others who invested in this building, now you've invested in renewing and extending that, and then that is a sign of this generational vision to say, actually, we believe God has got a future and we need facility and a centre to serve that vision. And what an amazing job you've done. And it really does feel like this morning when Simon invited me to come and speak, he invited me to come and speak about the send, and I'll share a little bit about that. But as I prayed about it, I felt that what God wants to talk about is generations. And that feels like what the building is speaking about, is generations. And as we talk about investing in the next generation, it isn't just about young people, it's about every generation. And I hope that will come through as I share. So we're going to look at this passage from 1 Chronicles 22. And that passage, just to give you a little bit of background, is that Solomon is going to build the temple, and David has had this realization that even though God had put it on his heart to build the temple, he wasn't going to build it. And so in that realization, David begins to think through what's the implications of that. And he begins to understand a number of things. So in the wider passage, it talks about how David had been involved in battles and had been fighting Israel's battles in order to produce a place where they could have a city and a center in Jerusalem and they could build the temple. And that was his calling. And as God said, you've shed blood, David. Your calling isn't to build a temple. You were to fight and to bring a place of peace. And David had done that. But now the next generation had a new calling, which was to build the temple. And as we use that as a framework to think now about what God is doing today, we begin to realize, as David did, that different generations have different callings. That God works in one generation in one way, in anticipation of what he will do in another generation. And I really believe that we are in a time in which God is speaking again about the generations and how he always brings about the multiplication of his kingdom through this generational journey from one to another. We see it from David to Solomon. We see it in the New Testament with Jesus to his disciples, to Paul, to Timothy. We see it in the Old Testament he's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God always works through generations to bring about the multiplication of his kingdom. And so as we think about what God is doing in our generation, I just want to use this as a passage to just give us a framework about what God might be wanting to say to us. The reason that this passage is something I'm using is because in June 2022, I went to Norway to an event called The Send. I didn't know anything about The Send, but a friend of mine invited me there. And when I went to the Telenor Arena in Norway, I saw 10,000 young people worshipping God passionately. And then they all did what it showed on the screen, if we can get that back up, I wonder if we go back to, there we go. They all put their shoes in the air. And we've had Ephesians 6 reference this morning with the armor. This is about the gospel, feet fitted with the gospel of peace. And they took their shoes and they put their shoes in the air and they said, I will go. I will go with the gospel wherever you send me, Jesus. And as a response to it, they signed up and they said, I'll go to my school, as we've heard already this morning from Naomi and Declan. I'll go to my university. I'll go to my neighborhood. I'll go to vulnerable children. I'll go to the nations. I will go. And as I saw this happening in front of me in Norway, I felt God just break me for the UK. And I said, God, you have to do this in the UK. You have to call a generation to rise up in you again, because we are desperate to see you move again. And as I prayed for the UK in this way, he brought me to this passage. And I read this passage in the Telenor Arena. And I felt God saying to me that just as God called Solomon to build the temple, that younger generation was going to build a temple for the Lord. He was going to do a work in this next generation that would restore the church and would build a church and a people for himself that would bring glory to his name. And I had such a conviction that what I realized was that as I looked at the devastation of what secularism had done to our nation and the small numbers, as Naomi was praying, of young people in our churches, I realized that what I've been praying almost was, God, it'd be great to have some more people of that generation in our church. Almost just to try to redress the balance or make me feel better or whatever. But actually what God was speaking to me about was not just that he was going to put more young people in the church, but they had a destiny. That this generation was the generation in which he was going to move afresh in order to restore the church and release a move of God in this nation that we haven't seen before. Now in 2022, there were no signs of this happening, friends. We're just out of COVID. It's about the same time that Naomi started praying, actually. There were no signs of this. It's like, God, how are you going to do this, I'm saying? How can this happen? But fast forward to 2025, and we see the signs of what God said to me in that arena that he is going to do, that this generation is going to move. He's going to move in this generation in a fresh way that we've never seen before. And so you might have seen or heard reference to the Quiet Revival report that the Bible Society researched. And what you see on the screen is really interesting. In the light blue, it tells you where we were in 2018. Now in 2018, the 18 to 24 says that only 4% of 18 to 24-year-olds regularly, once a month, engaged with church. That's how devastating it was. If you look at my generation, 55 to 64, there were 10% of us. 65 plus, there were 14%. Now what that tells us is that my generation and those older than me have not been able to pass on the faith to the younger generation. Now, friends, I just want to share a little bit about this in this moment, because I don't feel a condemnation from the Lord over this. I feel that this is just a recognition that in our generation, we have been in such a battle with secularism. Honestly, it has been such an attack and such a sort of threat to the Christian faith as this country has gone further and further away from the foundations of the Christian faith. The new atheists that were so confident in the early 2000s, the secularism that promised that it could fulfill every one of your desires. You define yourself, you have a new experience, you buy a new product, science will solve all of our problems. This is what has been just relentlessly thrown at our children and our grandchildren across these decades. And friends, I feel a sense of the Lord of saying, you've been faithful. You've maintained a witness. You've kept going, church. It's been relentless. And it's been worth it because I haven't finished yet. And I'm going to move again. And now today, if we look at that screen again, I don't know how I get that back up. There we go. We see that in the 18 to 24-year-olds in 2024, that 16% of them are now engaging with church on a monthly basis. 4 times what was the case 7 years ago. Now, friends, this is not a revival yet. This is fragile. This is early. These are the first fruits of what God is beginning to do. But in that generation, what has happened for them is they've never had a chance to reject the Christian faith because they never knew it. And so they are not post-Christian because they were never Christian. So we often say this is a post-Christian society. I really believe that we are pre-revival. That's what is over this generation because they've never known the Lord and he's beginning to move. And they now know that secularism lies to them, that it doesn't fulfill every one of their needs, that another Netflix series, another product will not solve all of their problems, that defining themselves does not bring peace and fulfillment, it brings anxiety and a sense of lostness. And they know that now because they've seen a long run of this and they're hungry for something more. And God is beginning to move. And beautiful stories just from Declan's testimony and seeing what's happening in the school there. Just fantastic. But a couple just from last week, Stephen Foster in St Aldate's, which is a student city, and so seeing more of what we're talking about. He told just one story from one university school in which one young woman had a dream in the night that she must read Luke's gospel. And Jesus came and spoke to her and said, "Come and read about me because I am who I say I am." She wakes up with a conviction that she must read Luke's gospel, but she said she's fearful because she doesn't have a Bible. And then she looks at her bedside table and there is a Bible open at Luke's gospel. Come on, Jesus. This is what he did. She goes into school. She meets another friend who the same night has a dream. And she says, "I saw heaven. I don't know, I think it was heaven, but there were angels everywhere. And they were crying this word, holy, holy, holy. And there was this man in the middle of it in white. And I wonder if that's Jesus." And then her friend says, "That's who came to see me in my dream." And then her friend, who's a Christian, says, "Yeah, this is all in the Bible, guys. Let's read this together." This is just 3 people in a university, God breaking into their lives because he's saying, "I have not finished yet with this generation. This is not the end of the story." Now, friends, as I said, this is not revival yet. This is the early stages. And what we need to do as the church is we need to go from a sense of we see the first fruits, and rather than just sort of going, "Thank goodness, I'm encouraged, phew, God's doing something," what we then need to do is exactly what we were praying about earlier and hearing about earlier, which is how do we step into what God is doing? How do we respond? How do we change and allow God to move in a new way? So the really interesting thing is that as David thinks about, there we are. As David thinks about Solomon building this new temple, he realizes, this isn't just a youth movement that's about to happen. This is a responsibility on my generation. I need to actually support this generation because Solomon, he's very young and inexperienced. This is a lot that God has asked him to do. And what happens is when you realize that God has got a destiny for your son, you do everything you can to set him up for success. He brings all of his wealth. He buys things. He gets letters. He brings resources into Jerusalem so that Solomon has everything to fulfill his calling. And friends, as a church, we now need to respond to what God is doing and saying, how do we, as in our generations, in older generations, set this generation up to fulfill their calling? And I really believe it's not a calling just to come and sit in church and make us feel better. It's a calling for them to renew the church and rebuild the church and see it released as a sending missionary organization again. And we are going to experience a reverse discipleship in our generation, because these younger people are going to remind us about what it is to live on fire for Jesus. And we're going to come alive again through them, through the send. I've just been so blessed by every time I have interaction with the send, is that we've, since that moment in the Telenor Arena, we've held events across the UK and Ireland. We've connected with and called over 30,000 of this generation to live all in for Jesus and to go for it with the gospel. And they have. And what we do after every single one of our events is we go out on the streets and share Jesus with people. And it's right what Naomi said earlier. We don't always have to be that person who's loud and extrovert. But in the New Testament, there was a culture on the church that said they were ready to go. It wasn't that everybody was the same, people were different, but they were ready to go. And what we see in this younger generation is they're ready to go. So the Send was birthed because we held an event in the Salvation Army after the Telenor Arena. We said, can we do this? So off Oxford Street, Salvation Army, we with a couple of weeks to go, with a few Instagram posts, we called as many people together as we could at the end of 2023, this was, in November 23. And 400 young people turned up. We worshipped, we prayed for revival, and then we said, who wants to go out on the streets? 200 of them just went out on the streets and shared Jesus. People got healed, people got saved, and we said after now, let's meet back in McDonald's. There's an anointing on McDonald's, there really is. We met in McDonald's, we're gathering, we're sharing stories, and then a young guy gets up on the table and he preaches the gospel to the whole of McDonald's. And he calls people to give their lives to Jesus. 2 people get out of their seats and come and kneel in front of him in McDonald's. And when I saw that, I thought, okay, Lord, you're up to something. You're doing something. They are ready for God to move. They need our support. They need us to resource them and help them. I really believe that God is changing the words over this generation. That we've said it's secular, but actually they are spiritual and they're ready for an encounter with God. We've said that this is the fatherless generation. The really interesting thing is that they are hungry for family. They want intergenerational relationships. They don't just want, as certainly in my generation and in other generations, they've said, no, leave us alone. We've got it now. We'll do it ourselves. This generation says, no, I want support. So if you're in an older generation, you have a vital role to play as spiritual mothers and fathers, mentors, people that will stand and pray and walk alongside and encourage in ministry and raise them up. They need family. We've said that they're the anxious generation and there's a massive issue with mental health. But God is going to make them a bold and a joyful generation. Because when they find their identity in Jesus, he is the one that can actually root them in the truth of who they are and set them free from what the world and the enemy have thrown at them. And finally, we've said they're an amoral generation. They just do what they like. But actually, what we're finding is they're hungry for reading the Bible. And when they read the Bible, they say, okay, I'm going to try and put this into practice. It doesn't mean they're sorted overnight, but they are ready to follow Jesus. And God is changing this generation. David said, the house that is to be built is going to be magnificent. It's going to be for the fame and the splendor of the Lord in the sight of all nations. Friends, I really believe that the church in this nation is going to look unrecognizable in decades ahead. But we are going to have to go through a transition and a reformation that will cause us to be no longer those disciples that just come and sit in a building on a Sunday morning, but a sending church that sends missionaries across the world, that sends missionaries into different parts of communities, that plants churches, that goes with the gospel. And for that to happen, we're going to have to go on a journey. So as we get excited by what God is doing, we're going to have to realize the cost. That's what David was recognizing. This is going to cost a lot. It's going to cost us a lot to go on this journey. Be ready. Steel yourself for this. Be ready for what God is going to do. And join in as he gives you opportunity. Because in each location, it is different. And the final thing I want to say is, David said, I will make preparations for it. So I think the question as we come into land is, what is God calling you here at St. Andrews to do? How do we join in with what God is doing? How do we find our place? Just to say that with a friend of mine called Anne Calver, I wrote a book called Awaken, the Lord is Doing a New Thing. It's just to help people have something to engage with. What might this look like? What's God asking of us? It's a conversation. Actually, a church leader said this. They said, it gives me something to have a conversation with God about what he's doing and what I need to do. And it gives us as a church something to have a conversation with. We've got some content to talk about. So if you're interested, there's some books at the back. There's a way to pay, which is you take a picture of my bank details that are on the table, and that you go home and you pay me. If you forget to pay me, God bless you. It's okay. But if you could pay me, that would be really helpful. They're £10 instead of £15. So there you go. There's a bargain for you. But the main question I want to ask is, how do we make preparations for what God is wanting to do? So if you would stand with me, I'd love you to stand and pray. The band would like to come back up. That would be great. And I think this is more to start with about posture rather than sort of going and doing stuff. It's about saying yes to what the Lord is doing. And Lord, how can I serve you? But I think there are some things that the Lord might want just lay on our hearts this morning. So Lord, as we're before you, I just pray with hearts open before you, you would come, Holy Spirit, in the light of this word about a fresh generational move of your Spirit. We just want to say yes, Lord. Well, we don't know the fullness of what that means, but we know that you are moving, and so we say yes. We say, come, Holy Spirit. And I just felt before the service that God was saying that the story hasn't finished yet. And I felt it was for St. Andrews, that what you've done with the building is just a confirmation that there is a sense of a new generation, a future generation that God is going to birth through this church. But I also felt it was for people in my generation and perhaps older, where you just feel so devastated about what has happened in your family, in your children and in your grandchildren that don't know the Lord. And as I said before, there's no condemnation. I've got 2 daughters. One of them is going for it with the Lord. One is really not. And she's open, but we're just wrestling with that. But there's no condemnation. But this word this morning is for you to say, God hasn't finished yet with your family. And for you to hear that with faith and begin to pray afresh and say, Lord, please, for my family, would you do this? And there's also a word in there, as well as for those who are in a younger generation, to step into your destiny, that you are the generation God is going to use to reform and renew his church into what it's called to be. There is a call for all of us to say yes to this going with the gospel, to be ready to be on the move. And God might just be confirming that in your workplace, as we had the tie and the helmet and stuff earlier, where God is calling you. So I'm going to invite Jamie to come back up, but when the band are playing, I'd love it if you want to just come and stand at the front on behalf of your family. Just say, Jesus, you haven't finished. You haven't finished yet. Maybe you want to come because you feel that sense of call to go into your workplace or your family or your street. There's just a sense of God reminding you of that. Maybe you're in a younger generation. You want to say, Lord, please, I want to step into the fullness of what that is. But if you want to receive prayer, if you want to respond first to the Lord, just come, and then people will pray for you. I don't know if you want to share, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you, John. If the prayer ministry team want to come forward, if you felt led to respond in how John's asked us to, then please do. I'll hand over to Stacey and the band.